Next speaker is David Roochnik. David is a professor of philosophy and the Maria Stata Professor of Classical Greek Studies at Boston University. He's the author of 35 articles, probably more by now, on Greek philosophy, Greek literature, rhetoric, ancient and modern, postmodernism, and the nature of philosophy itself. Several of my friends have studied with David at BU, have spoken extremely highly of his abilities as a teacher and philosophical guide. A few of his articles related to the topic of this conference are The Uselessness of the Humanities in the journal Expositions, Socrates' Pedagogical Flexibility, 2 case studies in the journal Teaching Philosophy, and The Serious Play of Plato's Euthydemus in the journal Interpretation. Please welcome David to the stage.
Thank you very much, Jon. Pleasure to be here. Does everybody have a handout? If you don't, maybe I'll just... We're a small enough group, I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I would much prefer just to work... Oh, actually, can I have one of those? I can't look at the screen, so... So again, thank you very much. I prefer the handout, as I mentioned. I'm a text guy. That's what I do for a living. So I like it when people I'm talking to are sharing a text. In this case, it's just what would have been my PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, again, thanks to Jon. I am just delighted to be here. I think this is a hugely important topic. It's not talked about nearly enough, and I'm just very glad to be able to talk about it today with you. It's an important topic, and it's rather obviously an important topic here at Boston College, at a liberal institution. What is the future of the liberal arts? Very much connected to the future of work and leisure. And we who have been working at liberal institutions for a while, as I have, we all know why this is an important topic. It's important because, especially from that corner of the liberal arts known as the humanities, many of us feel we're under siege. We're under siege because the technical fields threaten to overwhelm us at our universities. And I always am a great believer in the saying, follow the money. You want to know what's going on at universities, disregard what most of the administrators say, follow the money. So the first slide, it would have been more dramatic if it was the slide, but it's item number 1 on your handout. I think I found this on BC's website. And I mention it or include it not because in any way am I trying to single out Boston College, which in fact I think is far better equipped to deal with these issues than most universities, but we see headlines like this all the time. Boston College plans to build a $150 million science facility and offer a new engineering major. Just look at the buildings going up around Boston. I mean, they're like mushrooms. I mean, mushrooms on steroids. I mean, they're just popping up all over. The Harvard campus on Alston, the buildings at BU, the extraordinary, just from an architectural point of view, building at Northeastern, and Boston College is part of this, of course. I think this is very important for us to think about, this sense of the technical fields achieving a kind of domination of our universities. And again, it's fairly obvious I would say that because I'm the endangered species here, and I hope to survive a little bit longer. But I think it's more important than just what happens to me and to my little field, but really what happens to universities. Why is this so important to think about? Well, I would say the first thing is, to make it clear what's not my reason. It's not because in any way, shape, or form the new engineering major at BC is bad, or technical thinking, technical work is in some way negative. I mean, that's absurd. It's an obvious field where human intelligence is at work in a marvelously creative way. So many of the people in that new engineering facility here at BC will be trying to make life better along the lines Peter was describing. I mean, we know what's been accomplished, and we know more and more will be accomplished, and so many of the people working in these buildings are really concerned with making the world a better place, a more interesting place, and so on. That's not the problem. To think it's somehow negative or bad is silly. After all, this is the engine of progress. And again, Peter made such a good case for showing us, where is this progress really being felt on Earth, and it's pretty much everywhere. So that's a good thing. What's the bad thing? What's the dark side? And I don't quite share the optimism that Peter did. I think the real problem comes when the technical fields dominate, when they consume everything in its path, as I think they are threatening to do. Again, speaking mainly of my campus, Boston University down the road, I have the greatest respect for Boston College and really the Catholic traditions. I think are going to have more resources to resist than BU will, frankly. But that's my fear, is this notion of dominance or consumption, of eating everything in its path. Why is that bad? Why might I call that a disaster? Well, if it happens, then I think people will work all the time. Again, this is rather different from the story Peter's telling. And why would that be? And I think it's the following, namely that in the quest for progress, progress is infinite, is potentially infinite. We can have a faster computer, but there's no such thing as the fastest computer. I mean, anything we can build better. Better, faster, stronger, more resilient. Any drug we can come up with can be superseded by a better, more powerful drug. The consequences, I see it, is that if the technical fields dominate, if that becomes the paradigm of knowing, of learning, of education, of life itself, then work becomes endless. And if you look at the second item on the handout, Descartes 400 years ago, I think you get a little sense of this. Knowledge that would be very useful in life, he says, and this is referring to what I would call technical knowledge, renders us, as it were, masters and possessors of nature, very famous phrase. This is desirable not only for the invention of an infinity of devices that would enable one to enjoy trouble-free the fruits of the earth, but also principally for the maintenance of health, which unquestionably is the first good and the foundation of all the other goods of this life. For the mind depends so greatly on the temperament and on the disposition of the organs of the body that if it is possible to find some means to render men generally more wise and adroit than they have been up until now, I believe that one should look for it in medicine. Through medicine, one could rid oneself of, he uses the word again, an infinity of maladies, and perhaps even the frailty of old age. So, of course, what he's referring to there is a dream that is now being pursued very seriously, which is conquering death itself. Achieving something like infinity, an infinite lifespan. That is a dream of progress, it's an infinite task, and the consequence is you're never done, right? You can't work hard enough because there's always more progress to be made. Now, again, just following with my series of why questions, why is that a disaster? Why might that be a disaster? Just at least entertain that for a moment as a hypothesis. It's again because endless work would be the consequence. And I think that's a disaster because it would destroy the very possibility of leisure. And my view, and this is the title of my talk, you see it at the top, and it's a little quotation really from Aristotle, who has been mentioned twice, I'm delighted to say, work is for the sake of leisure. I'm going to come back to that quote shortly. If work is for the sake of leisure, if leisure is the goal of work, as Aristotle believes, endless work is a catastrophe because it renders work without a goal. That's why it's endless. That's what it means to be infinite. It has no end. And that I see as a grave danger facing, honestly, our entire culture. I have a couple of just quick little samples. You don't need them really because we're all so familiar with this this sort of sense of life that you see expressed in number 3 on the handout. I find this one to be my favorite. I don't know if you've ever heard of Soylent. It's a drink that buy in a bottle. And here's the ad from their website, Soylent.com. When every second counts, food simplified. If you've ever skipped breakfast after rolling out of bed too late, if you've ever missed a lunch because of a busy schedule, Soylent is made for you. Proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and micronutrients. Each Soylent product contains a complete blend of everything the body needs to thrive. It turns a full meal into a one-step process. It makes things a lot less complicated, and when you're busy, it takes eating off your plate. To me, that's a vision of hell. I mean, no more plates. I mean, I don't know about you, but I count that I count plates among my favorite objects. When they're heaped with food, and there's more than one plate at the table, and there's a nice, slow, long meal. It takes a lot of time, it does indeed. But that's the time when not every second counts. What counts is, how's the food, how's the wine, how's the conversation? That's a nightmare vision, Soylent.com, in my view. Number 4, this is another version of the nightmare vision. It comes from my gym, which is down the road. I know BC people sometimes go to this gym. I'm friendly with some of them. It's called the Commonwealth Sports Club. This is its advertisement. It's more than a gym. We truly believe in getting results. So we provide the ideal fitness programs that keep you inspired to achieve your goals. I grew up in gyms. I've been going to gyms forever. And I like this gym. I'm old. I need to have some kind of exercise just to be able to move the next day. But there's a certain nightmare quality to these gyms. You see people doing the most outlandish thing, being barked at by trainers, and having lots of measuring devices strapped to them. How's my heartbeat? How many calories? And then they record it on their phones, carrying sleds filled with weights, looking like oxen. I just think the whole thing is so weird that I can't even now get used to it. Even though I very much like this place and spend a lot of time there, I find it very weird. But the key words in that quote in number 4 are results and goals, right? You go to a gym to what? To work at, right? To achieve a certain intended goal. These are harbingers of a future that I'm not too happy about, I have to say. Again, my thesis is that leisure is the true goal of work, and if the technical world, the technical work dominates, then the very possibility of leisure is destroyed. Then work, which never will end, has no goal, which is to say, it becomes meaningless. Okay, now, next sort of section, this was mentioned by Peter, I think in particular. This may seem like a contemporary phenomenon, but as he showed, it certainly isn't a contemporary phenomenon. This conversation goes way back, very much so to the 19th century, when the university, as we understand it, was being forged in Germany and Europe, and notably in Ireland, and think of the works of Newman, commenting on these things. I'm going to go even further back, all the way to the ancient Greeks, to Socrates and Plato, and it's really with their assistance that I will address the themes of this conference. I'm going to begin with Socrates. Socrates, who appears in Plato. Don't have to worry now if it's the real Socrates or Plato's character. That's another question. Obviously, living as he did, 2,400 years ago, he didn't have much by way of technology by our standards, but what he certainly had was the idea. And it's captured in number 5. There's a word that is extremely important in Plato's dialogues. The word is technical. And it's, of course, the root of our word technical and technology. This is a pervasive concern in Plato's works, and Socrates talks about it often. It can be translated as skill, art, expertise, profession. I like to think of it, just to have the resonance with the English word, as technical knowledge. So what was Socrates' let's say, attitude towards techne? That's my first question. And again, like me, I suppose, shouldn't really compare myself to Socrates, but it's not negative. It couldn't be negative. Again, that would seem so profoundly foolish. And in number 6, it may not seem obvious, I think he really addresses this. So he gives an analogy. He loves this analogy. If a man is an athlete and this is what he does he pay attention to the praise and blame and the opinion of every man, or does he pay attention to one man alone? He who happens to be a doctor or a trainer, to one man alone. Then, says Socrates, he should fear the blame and welcome the praise that comes from this one man and disregard all those that come from the many. That one man, this is my language, is the technites. It's a Greek word, the person who has a techne, the expert, the skilled professional, the highly trained technical person. And the point is just very simple. I think actually medicine is the easiest example, pervasive example in Plato. You break your leg and you're in pain. What you want is an expert. You want a doctor real quick. You want somebody in a nice white coat, lab coat, who you can defer to, right? You want them to take care of you. The last thing on earth you want, if your leg is broken, is random people suggesting what you should do. You go to the expert. Of course you do. That is wonderful and great achievement of the human race, to have such people around. So where's the problem from Plato's point of view, Socrates' point of view? The problem will come, I think, when, again, as I'm suggesting is actually happening, when technical knowledge, begins to absolutely dominate. Right? And he expresses this in his work, The Apology. Many of you have read it. You remember, perhaps if you haven't read it, Socrates is going around interrogating people, trying to find out who really has wisdom. He goes to the politicians, he goes to the poets, and then he says in number 7, finally, I went to the technicians, the way I will translate it. But you can see even if you don't know Greek, you'll see in that word I have in parentheses in number 7, that word techne, kerotechnos. These are people with techne. This is what he says. I was aware that about their fields I knew next to nothing, and that I would discover that they knew many fine things. I believe he's entirely sincere about that. About this, I was not mistaken, for they did know about things which I did not, and in this sense they were wiser than I. But, men of Athens, he's addressing the jury, the technicians, my translation, seem to suffer from a serious defect. Because they could execute their expertise so well, they believed that they were wisest when it came to the most important matters. This failure of theirs obscured their own wisdom. In other words, the technicians think they know something they do not. Now, what I believe he's talking about there, and this is a matter of interpretation, what does he mean by the most important matters? I think it's this. Yes, the technical fields, the experts, the marvelously trained, technically adept people in our midst, they know a great many things. They develop technologies and devices that are extraordinary in their power. But here's what they don't know. They don't know how they should be used, right? You can have a technical device and it will give you a lot of power, but how should it be used? And it's, of course, debates we have all the time. You look at our extraordinary achievements. Easy example, in big data, right? This is much in the news these days, right? This big data is an extraordinary technical achievement. The ingenuity behind it is staggering. How should it be used? We're debating this as we speak. This debate is going on. It's very possible it'll be used in enormously pernicious ways. It may be used in very beneficial ways. But the question is, what's the difference between a pernicious application of a techne or a device and a beneficial, positive application of a techne or a device? Well, to answer that question, you have to ask a bunch of other questions, such as, well, what is beneficial to human beings? What is it to have a good life? That is what techne has no answer for. Right? Technology has no answer for it. In very broad strokes, I would simply say, technical knowledge, techne, I'll continue to use the Greek word, is value neutral. Right? It's enormously successful at generating power. That's what Descartes admires so much about it. And it's extraordinary in Descartes because again, he's working 400 years ago. There wasn't much by way of technique, but he can see the future, especially in medicine, and how powerful it's going to become. But how is it going to be used? How is it going to be used? That becomes Socrates' question. Right? Not specifically how should it be used, but the question, what is a good life? What truly benefits human beings? What is it to be a human being? And Socrates will never say, I know the answer to these questions, but he's crystal clear, those are the most important questions. Those are the questions that he devotes himself to. If you turn to the second page of the handout, the real danger with techne is not, again, putting it sort of crudely, it's not that it's bad, that's the silly part, but that it becomes technocracy. Technocracy is built from two Greek words, techne, and the last few syllables, rule by techne. Techne rules. I think we're entering a very technocratic age, and if my analysis or my suggestions are cogent, the notion that techne is value neutral, that portends very significant problems. So that becomes the Socratic quest, the famous Socratic questions. What is good? What is beautiful? What is just? What's the best life a human being can lead? These are questions that are pursued not just by philosophers in philosophy departments. Generally, however, I'd say they're pursued by people in the liberal arts, especially perhaps in the humanities section of that, perhaps not even there. But that's the question of the liberal arts, and you can now sort of put it all together. If you're entering a technocratic age, it really will extinguish the urgency of the liberal arts and of a certain kind of question. There's a problem, though, in what Socrates says, and anyone who's read Plato and met Socrates, you know what it is. Socratic dialogues, as everyone feels, they don't end with answers. They end with questions more often than not. And as a result, they can be very frustrating. And that's very real. I mean, the kinds of conversations that Socrates has just seem to go on and on. Very unlike a research program executed with a specific goal in mind. The goal is delivered, the results can be quantified, and we can say success. What is success in a Platonic dialogue? Hard to say. They don't, in a way, Plato at times seems more interested in failure than success. These conversations he's depicting seem to, we the readers need to continue them. Now, I think this is a problem, and it's a real problem. And I think Plato's aware it's a real problem, because it can certainly now seem that a devotion to those questions is itself subject to criticism, because those questions don't seem to get us anywhere. In fact, they seem to impede progress. In other words, you, a student, anyone who has a choice between getting into a laboratory and really cranking out the next generation of antibiotics, which is very urgently needed, no, you're sitting around saying, what's beautiful, right? And you don't seem to get anything done by just sitting around asking what's beautiful, what's just, what's good. In number 9, you're going to see, I think, that Plato himself will depict the pushback against Socratic questioning, which I'm suggesting is intrinsic to the project of the liberal arts. There's a guy named Callicles. It's a little out of context, but I think you'll get the point. Callicles, number 9 on the handout, Callicles criticizes Socrates. The philosopher Callicles says, becomes unmanly because he escapes from the central institutions of the city, those in which, as the poet says, men become distinguished. It said, the philosopher sinks low and spends the rest of his life whispering with 3 or 4 young people in a corner and never says anything free and strong and vital. I think about this very often. That's essentially a description of my career. I spent my whole career in a little corner, and the corner's getting smaller at BU. It's like this little shabby corner. The big glass buildings are going up all around where they're inventing new drugs and things. And then there's this little shabby corner where I am, and there's 3 or 4 young people there, And, you know, this is nothing. This isn't registering. It's hard to get press, you know. This is not part of the BU brand anymore, the little corner. So if you sort of translate this into something you're familiar with, this is a comment that would be, I think, more accessible to undergraduates, let's say. I often think of that moment, because I had it, when an undergraduate maybe goes home for Thanksgiving and says to his or her parents, you know, I want to major in philosophy, I want to major in music, in art history, in medieval French literature, whatever it happens to be. The parent, number 10, then says, well, what can you do with that? What can you do with that? And that's a very fair question. My father asked me, my father was an engineer. I remember when I told him I was majoring in philosophy. After first threatening to disown me, he then, you know, got a little bit more genteel about it and said, oh, what can you do with that? That's a totally fair question. That's the question that Plato, I think, is asking in number 9. Plato himself is asking that. Well, there's always one good answer to that question. It's number 11. I think this is Peter's answer. And it's a good one. I have a little quote from a Wall Street Journal article. And it was titled, "If you want your child to succeed, don't sell liberal arts short. Fields of study centered on philosophy, history, literature, art, music help us appreciate the ambiguity of the world, which in turn exercises our creative muscles. Liberal arts nurture disagreement among students and help them develop the ability to marshal cogent arguments in support of defensible positions. The ability to express a viewpoint verbally and then articulate it in writing is a skill that will serve graduates whether they are pitching a business plan to a venture capital firm or writing a report to shareholders explaining why their portfolios took a hit last quarter." And this is by a man named Michael Zim, who was described as a creative strategist at Digital Surgeons, an experienced design company. I don't know what an experienced design company is, but maybe I need to consult him so I can have more experiences. I don't know, or what more better designed experiences, whatever that might be. That's a very good answer. It's a very sensible answer, and I think it has a deep grain of truth. However, I don't think it's the best answer. And I think finally it's an unsatisfying answer because it's subordinating the liberal arts to the technical fields. It's saying, yeah, you should study liberal arts because, you know, as again, Peter and so many others are telling us, you know, at Apple, at Mark Cuban and those guys, they're always saying now, you know, things are changing so fast that we need thinkers, we don't need people who have computer science majors, we need people who can learn, learning how to learn. Again, familiar refrain, again, I believe it has real truth, but notice what's happening in the argument. It's being subordinated to something else, namely to contributing to Apple or Google or Amazon or Facebook, the big four, right? You can get a job there if you've majored in medieval French literature because you've learned how to code and decode. And you can apply that when you start writing code. So I don't think I think it's a rich answer, it's a good answer, but I don't think it's the best answer, at least not for me. And now I turn to Aristotle, because I think he does have a real answer. And I'll just close the talk just by focusing on Aristotle. Number 12. Happiness, Aristotle says, seems to be found in leisure, skole. Russell mentioned this word. I think of this leisure as free time. I'll explain what I mean. We engage in non-leisurely work in order to be at leisure. I think you wanted a verb, you wanted leisure to be a verb. There it is a verb in Greek. Skolas domen, it just means we are at leisure, we leisure. I leisure, you leisure, he, she, it leisures. It is a verb. So, famous quote, you probably get the feel for it right away. I think it takes a while, however, to really think of what the implications of this are. And the first one I think you should notice is that in Aristotle's mind, if you notice, there's the word for leisure, skole, and then I have a hard time translating this word, askolumatha. I translate it as non-leisurely work. And I do that to reflect the Greek, because in the Greek, when you put it alpha and a in front of a word, it's a negative prefix. So it means to be non-leisurely. This passage is typically translated, we engage in work for the sake of leisure. And that's fine, but I'm trying to emphasize the fact that in Aristotle's mind, it's leisure that's the positive phenomenon. And being absent of leisure is derivative. It's derivative linguistically. And he goes on, number 12. He says, the whole of human life is divided into non-leisurely work, askolia, the absence of skole, of leisure, and leisure, and into war and peace. And in practical work-related activities, some are directed at necessary and useful objectives, while others are directed at fine and noble ones. War is for the sake of peace, and work is for the sake of leisure. It's the title of my talk. And necessary and useful objectives are for the sake of noble ones. Okay. This is all, these passages I'm showing you from Aristotle, typical of Aristotle. He's very dense, cryptic sometimes. But I'll just, you can come back and talk about them if you want. So the question you want to ask next, of course, is why? I mean, why is leisure the goal of work? And, you know, I think a lot of ways of answering this, but I'll put it simply. For Aristotle, leisure is required in order to really think. Right? And he says this, or expresses this, in number 13. He says, it is on account of wonder, which I think you could also translate as being amazed, that human beings, both now and in the past, began to philosophize. And again, as Peter pointed out, when Aristotle uses the word philosophy, he's not referring to the discipline that we know today. He's much broader, seeking wisdom, whether it's in biology or mathematics or French literature. You need to have this sense of wonder. Wonder may be more prosaically expressed, you know, finding the world interesting and just being curious. I think Russell used that word. You know, just finding it compelling and sort of forcing you to ask questions about it, forcing you to ask why. Big Aristotelian question, why? And so I indicate in number 13 what I just mentioned. By philosophy, he's not restricting it to a department in a contemporary university. It's really what today we would call the liberal arts, the 7 that you saw in the Peter slide. And then he says, continuing in 13, when the techni, a word we know, when the techni have been established, there should be, it's a plural, those kinds of knowledge that are directed neither towards the achievement of necessary and useful results, nor to producing pleasure were discovered. And this occurred in those places where some people had leisure. So, for example, mathematics was first discovered by the Egyptians, where they allowed their priests to be at leisure. So it's only in the condition of leisure that real thinking will take place. Now, what is leisure? Leisure, again, we've said, is free time. When you're there simply for the sake of being there. When you're not trying, as happens at my gym, when you're not trying to achieve a measurable result. And Aristotle will take this one step further to a statement that would be flabbergasting to the contemporary American student at BC or BU. 14, those whose knowledge is not useful are, for just this reason, considered to be wiser than those whose knowledge is useful. Right? That's a positive indicator for Aristotle, is precisely the uselessness of the quest for this kind of knowledge. It's inspired not with the hope of achieving progress, but just because it's wonderful. It's just inspiring me to ask questions. That appeals to me. Now, this may sound very backwards to us, and I think it does sound backwards, and it would sound backwards to Callicles, who criticized Socrates. I want to suggest, and I'll do this very briefly, that in a way this absolutely makes just a kind of common sense. There's a deep commonsensical strand, I think, in almost all of Aristotle's thinking, even when it doesn't seem that way. And I think, and it's a very crude paraphrase of the argument that begins the Nicomachean Ethics, number 15, intrinsic versus instrumental goods. Let me just give you simple examples. We do A for the sake of B, which in turn leads to C. I walk to the store to buy milk, which I plan to drink, right? Means and ends, means and ends. That's clearly the way so much of our lives operated. Why did I walk to the store? In order to buy some milk. Why did I want to buy milk? In order to drink the milk. The big question, though, is this, for Aristotle. Is there a highest good? Right? Is there a good which doesn't lead to another good? Is there an end in itself? Is there a final good? Right? Something which, I mean, the milk is, I walk to the store for something, for a reason other than walking to the store. I walk to get the milk, right? And then when I buy the milk, I don't just buy it for the sake of buying it, I buy it so I can drink it. Is there an activity that we embrace simply for itself? That's the huge question for the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle's argument is this, and it takes a long time to really discuss it fully, but I'll just mention it. He believes that if there were no highest good, life would be meaningless. Right? And what meaningless means in this context is simply there would be no goal, there would be no end. Right? If A is for the sake of B, and B is for the sake of C, and C is for the sake of D, and it just keeps going, and that's infinite, meaning no end, then you never get anywhere. That's just, you just keep going, you just work and work and work. I think that's built into the technocratic model of infinite progress. Just keep going. What's for what reason? Now, Aristotle believes, for reasons we can discuss, life is meaningful. It is not meaningless. Therefore, there must be a highest good. Must be a highest good. That's the beginning of the famous Nicomachean Ethics. Now, what is the highest good? Again, I have to be so brief here that it's worse than superficial, but number 16, it's thinking. It's inquiry, it's reasoning. Human beings, he says in number 16, by nature have an urge to understand. Human beings are the animals with logos. This is what we are, he believes. And our final good is being able, think of the Maslow pyramid that you saw on the board, on the slide in the first speech. That's the fullest self-actualization of a human being. That's the highest good. That's what we aspire to, even when we don't know we're aspiring to. Now, it's entirely possible, and I think, in fact, it's imperative that you question that. You might say, well, gosh, I don't think that's what human beings really are, that we're the animals with logos, we're reasonable. Maybe there are other features of being human that take precedence over our capacity to inquire, to learn. That's fine. I think the more important point, though, right, for this talk is simply that there has to be a highest good. Right? That's the key point. There has to be an end in itself, because if there were not, Aristotle's point, then life would be meaningless. And this will allow, it may not be what he thinks it is, I happen to think it is, but even if he's wrong about that, there still would have to be this sort of ultimate. Otherwise, the other option is infinite. That's the plug-in with leisure, because you might say leisure is for itself time. When you have leisure, free time, then you're engaging in an activity for no reason other than the activity. So leisure is isomorphic with this highest good, and in fact it's a necessary condition to pursue the highest good for Aristotle. And he puts this pretty clearly, I think it's 17. Just as we say that a free human being is one who lives for the sake of himself and not for another, so too only that kind of thinking which takes place in leisure and is impelled by wonder and which is strictly for the sake of itself is the only real freedom of thought. That's real freedom. That's the only, by his lights and his conception of freedom, which of course we could debate, only place we find it. So I close now with just this one line in the Politics, which is typical of Aristotle. It's just one line, but it's pretty staggering to me. 18. He says, this is repeats, war is for the sake of peace. War for him is, of course, the least leisurely of all activities. War and politics are the least leisurely of activities. So war is for the sake of peace. Non-leisurely work, that's my translation of Ascolia, is for the sake of leisure. Then he says something that is really, to my mind, disturbing. He says, war compels men to be just and temperate, while good fortune and enjoyment and being at leisure with peace makes them arrogant and violent. That should pull you up pretty short, right? Because, well, war is for the sake of peace, work is for the sake of leisure. I would argue in politics, where he sketches out his political views, really the argument there is really the purpose of politics itself is to achieve leisure for at least a portion of the population. But now he's saying, you know, you give people leisure and peace, and it makes them violent, arrogant. And I think I know what he has in mind too, because it's very familiar to all of us. I think it's a simple thought, which is most people can't handle free time. They just can't. What happens when you have free time? You get bored, you get restless, and if you're young, you start doing really stupid things just to stimulate yourself. I mean, this is the rule of thumb I always operate with. If you're ever walking around and you see a group of, let's say young men on the street at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're not wearing uniforms, there probably will be trouble. I think that's empirically verifiable. This is a sobering thought, which is, wow, people really can't handle leisure, even though it's the goal of everything else we do. Or most people. Most people are better off, and maybe Russell's talking about this when he was talking about necessity. War discipline, military discipline, is so useful for especially young people. It poses discipline from the outside, keeps them in line, otherwise they go crazy and wild, and aggressive impulses, but they're going to be channeled in a socially productive way. I think that's very true, frankly. So we seem to be at a bit of a crisis point now in this quotation number 18. But then he goes on to say, and this closes up the thought I have, which is, he says, philosophy, in our terminology, I think the liberal arts, is needed for leisure. And I think what he has in mind there, it goes back to several of the other points I tried to make, which is this notion of wonder. What a liberal education does for somebody is make the world interesting. Liberal education is the best antidote to boredom that there could be. The more you learn about the world, the more world you have to be interested in. Just a tiny, quick anecdote. I often think of the fact that when I was in college, I took a year-long course on the history of Western music. I did so only because a friend I admired told me to do it. I didn't come from a musical home. I didn't know anything about classical music. I took this course for a year and didn't do particularly well, but I did get exposed to a vast amount of music. And I was thinking about this on Friday night, just this past Friday night. My wife and I are home and we're just sort of bored. I mean, it's been crappy weather, nothing to do. Oh, there's a concert at Jordan Hall. Let's go to that concert. I went to that concert, heard a marvelous rendition of a certain Beethoven piece. And, that was a nice night. I really enjoyed Friday night because I had been educated. Right? The more you're educated, John Stuart Mill is superb on this subject. The more you're educated, the more pleasure you can take out of the world. And wonder, the impetus to real thinking for Aristotle is really the highest form of pleasure. I think that's very real. So this is the apology, the defense of the liberal arts, it seems to be, finally. It's needed for leisure. We just give people leisure, and I think they'll just be hell. I think half the population will be addicted to drugs. Another basic response to boredom and free time is just take drugs and get drunk. Very bad things. But if you're educated, you know really much better things to do. And that's why you do them. It's because they're better. So I close this, as has already been mentioned. I sent again, to my mind, one of the most wonderful of all sort of etymologies. What is a school? It just simply derives from the word scholae, especially a liberal arts school. It's a preparation, a way of learning how to revel in leisure. Thank you.
That last and disquieting passage where Aristotle says that leisure makes us hubristic.
Yes.
I wonder, I mean, it's one thing to say that under conditions of leisure, people who aren't trained for leisure will get bored and will do things that are perhaps destructive to themselves. It's another thing to say that they'll be arrogant and violent. And there's a suggestion that the activities of domination are what people will engage in under conditions of leisure, not just drinking a lot, but that they will become violent and arrogant, which is like kind of the domineering passions. And I wonder if you could just unpack that psychology. Why under leisure do we, according to Aristotle, give ourselves over to the pleasures of domination? Or am I inferring too much?
Well, I don't think you're inferring too much. In one sense, I don't think you are. I mean, I think what he has in mind here, Aristotle's amazingly cryptic. He just sort of says stuff he doesn't usually elaborate. I mean, I can only sort of fill in the gap in the following way. I think, and I hope this doesn't sound too gendered, I think this is referring, in his world, certainly to boys, to young men, and, empirically, they'll get very aggressive. I think it's for him an empirical matter. And you use the pronoun we. I think he's not talking about we, all of us. He's talking about especially these people who would tend to the arrogant and the violent. It's about the uneducated. And again, those who are educated, this is why we have the liberal arts. This is why liberal arts is such a good place for 19-year-olds, right? Is to channel that extraordinary energy that young people have and maybe prevent it from being self-destructive or aggressive. So yes, I mean, I think he does think that there's a tendency to domination, but he thinks it can be sublimated. It really comes out in book 1 in its discussion of money. Yes.
It strikes me to kind of follow that up, that in the passage that we've just been discussing, he might be considering the probability that given leisure and even some education, human beings might fall into the same difficulty as the technicians. That is, they think they know everything. And so what philosophy will do is kind of restore these elements of ambiguity and wonder that will take people to violent thinking. Will take people to the good parts of war, that is, war against not yet understanding.
Yeah, I mean, that of course sounds rather Socratic, doesn't it? I mean, that there is a kind of comparison or parallel to be made between the technicians and these people being described here. And I think the comparison would especially be negative. I mean, the danger of techne is that it's so impressive and so compelling and so effective and so useful, rather often, that it blots out the desire to learn anything else.
And
I think a lot of people.
It's the goal.
Pardon me?
And you think it's the goal, the end. And
Right. You think it's the entirety of intellectual activity, and the idea that you might take a step back from your work at a pharmaceutical industry where you're developing these extraordinary new drugs, and just say, well, what are they for? What really is the best use of our resources? Is very foreign to those folks. I think the people that Aristotle has in mind here are maybe more like the dog walker in Austin, Texas, who sound like a rather benign figure, but the slacker who, will drink a lot, will start doing a lot of nasty things out of the sheer need for stimulation. I mean, what is it to be an intellectual and to go forward in this life. Anybody in the industry, as I guess most of us are here, we all know it's a kind of self-discipline. It's, if you're a philosophy professor as I am, I have vast amounts of time to myself, where nobody's telling me what to do. And had I not developed the ability to give myself tasks and to organize my own life with the projects I thought were important, I think I probably would drink a lot. Now I just drink a little.
Much healthier.
Much healthier. Yes.
I have a clarification. Are there alternative translations for the word
I'm
schooling?
sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Are there alternative translations for the word schooling?
It's certainly leisure is the best.
Leisure is the best.
Yeah, that's certainly the
Has it
most
been translated in other ways?
Pardon me?
Has it been translated in other ways?
I'm unaware of any. You could free time.
Okay. Because I was wondering about, the quotation that you have from the politics, where it says, while good fortune, enjoyment, and being at leisure, what's being translated there? Being, is there a difference between being at leisure and something taking place in leisure?
Well, again, I think it's Peter's idea of transforming what for us is a noun into a verb. I leisure, you leisure, he, she, or it leisures, right? And the key feature of leisure that Aristotle is looking for, actually sort of reminding me of your earlier question about play. I'm not I thought you might ask me about the word work, because I think that's actually a tough one to think about. In Aristotle's mind, leisure is a condition for activity, for real activity, for the best activity.
Right.
And the problem, again, with the uneducated is they're without external constraints, they're unhinged. This is, by the way, I think is related to your notion of play, which is a very deep concern, mostly of Plato, but in a way also of Aristotle.
Thank you.
Yeah, John.
You talked about leisure as the condition for things like thinking. Maybe I'm wrong, but I always interpreted thinking as, well, let's just say like biological thinking. I would interpret biological thinking as one form of being at leisure, as opposed to leisure being preconditioned for, let's say, thinking about biology. Am I misunderstanding that, or?
Wait, say it one more time.
So is leisure something that allows these higher activities, these more noble activities, as Aristotle would call them, allows them to take place, or are those activities themselves leisure?
Yeah, I can see why this is not clear. I'm not sure I can get it clear. I think of it in such simple terms. Look, people in Syria, Iraq, places that are war-torn, they can't think.
Yeah.
I mean, they can think on a very minuscule level, but they're always being shot at and bombed, and they're always just running around trying to save themselves. If you're starving and you have to work 18 hours a day just to put food on the table, you're too tired to do any real thinking. That's the sense in which leisure is a condition for leisure, the best use of leisure activity. Leisure, both questions are making me think about how Aristotle uses that as a verb, and I'm honestly not sure. I mean, the key notion is always for Aristotle, as you know, activity and energeia, energy, right? And you're always going to be active. If you're starving and you're working 14 hours a day and then just eating, sleeping, working, like many of our parents and grandparents did, that's all activity, but it's not the highest form of activity. And the highest form of activity for Aristotle is unmistakable. It's philosophy. It's not thinking. It's wondering. That's available to a tiny number of people. This is a highly elitist conception of life. Let's just say it straight out. But I think liberal institutions are in their very nature elitist in this sense. Not, I hope, in the sense of being exclusive. The point about who can afford to study French literature in 2018 is a dire one. But the fact is, most people are better off in the army. protecting me, so that nobody shoots at me when I'm in my office thinking about Aristotle. You might think that's an objectionable view, but I think that's Aristotle's view.
Let's thank David for his
Yeah.
talk.